Ismael Pagán, and Professor Pagán is chairperson of the Civil Engineering and Survey Department at the University of Puerto Rico-Mayagüez, where he has served in numerous academic and administrative positions over the years. His research interests include hydrology, hydraulics, urban drainage, riverine and coastal floods, built and natural coastal infrastructure, education, natural and technological hazards. Professor Pagán is also a principal investigator in the Education and Workforce Development Program at the Coastal Resilience Center of Excellence, administered at UNC Chapel Hill. His project is titled Education for Improving Resiliency of Coastal Infrastructure, through which he has taught and mentored numerous engineering students, many of whom have graduated and found internships and permanent employment in the coastal resilience field. His current project expands on the former engineering research and education conducted through the CRC to support the long-term reconstruction of Puerto Rico following Hurricane Maria and the January 2020 earthquake sequences. Professor Pagán received his undergraduate and master's degrees in civil engineering from the University of Puerto Rico, after which he attended the PhD program in hydrosystems engineering at the University of Illinois at our Urbana-Champaign. He lives on one of the most beautiful islands in the world, amongst some of the most resilient people in the world, despite, or perhaps because of, a long history of hurricanes, tsunami, landslides, earthquakes, flooding, subsidence, and of course, a global pandemic. So welcome to you, Ismael. We're so glad you're here. And since you've already started sharing your screen, you can just begin your presentation. For my students, I've explained to Ismael that you can ask a question in the chat if you like. He doesn't mind the interjection during the presentation. We'll also be doing the normal kind of pre-submitted question, and I'll pop a couple out to get the ball rolling on that. So with that, Ismael, take it away.
Well, thank you very much for that beautiful introduction. I would love to come back next week just for the introduction, then I'll shut it down. Thank you, Anna. I am honored for your invitation. I'm very happy to be here with your students. Thank you, Josh, for your support. I'm very glad that we have this opportunity to share our experiences through our Coastal Resilience Center. I have to tell you that I have developed so many friends through the center, but we have learned so much, and we have been walking through very new fields, which we are really very, very satisfied. I would like to acknowledge that this work is not only mine. A group of people have been working on this area, and I'm going to try to share with you some of the engineering for resilience in Puerto Rico. And this would be very broad. I will try to concentrate on the things that happened after Hurricane Maria. But we have had so many challenges after that. I will touch a little bit on the earthquake, but I won't go very deep on that because it will take me maybe longer than what it takes me to explain Maria. If during my presentation you don't understand anything, don't worry. It's maybe because I'm speaking Spanish, Spanglish, or something strange. I hope Viviana can help me out with the translation. Thank you very much. We're gonna try to first identify what are the risks and vulnerabilities from natural multi-hazards in Puerto Rico, which we are exposed to. We'll talk about Maria, just to go into what happened with Maria, what is its description, and how big of a natural event was it. We'll enter into the hurricane impacts, on different aspects of infrastructure, like transportation, coast, buildings and housing, electric power system, roads and bridges, telecommunication, and others. We will also try to understand what is the Puerto Rico's resilient disaster reconstruction process with two particular initiatives. One is what we call the HSOAC, the Homeland Security Operational Analysis Center, sponsored by the Department of Homeland Security through FEMA, and the office developed by the Government of Puerto Rico, the Central Office of Recovery, Reconstruction, and Resilience, what we call Core 3. And we'll have some, at least a conclusion after this presentation. Just to understand what happens in Puerto Rico, our multi-hazards are based on our exposure to hurricanes, which create extreme winds, storm surges, waves, tides, and combination of those. In terms of earthquakes and soil instabilities, we are exposed to tsunamis, landslides, mud flows, subsidence, liquefaction. In terms of extreme rainfall, we have droughts. Actually, 2 months after Maria, we have a very extreme drought. Riverine flash floods, urban floods, nuisance floods, and composed floods. That's a combination between the coastal and the riverine floods. We are very small, but we are very populated. 44 out of 78 municipalities are in coastal zones exposed to coastal hazards. And on the other hand, the upland municipalities have been poorly planned and are located in very steep slopes. We have about 3.6 million people. That's about 1,000 per square mile. If you have an idea, maybe in your state, you could be 50 persons per square mile, maybe not more than 100. We are very close together. We are very one people. And we have a very large number of residences and built infrastructure, which were built without codes or formal construction processes, which creates a hazard. We have been in an economic hardship, which we have very limited access to financial resources to be prepared, and we need for hazard preparedness, awareness, and education. That's our focus in the future. Our population living in coastal community is about 50% of Puerto Ricans, about 1.7 million people. The population in flood-prone areas, it's about 500,000 people, about 15%. The population living in storm-surge areas is about 100,000 people. And structure within the flood-prone areas, it's about 250,000 structures exposed to all these hazards. And about over 1,000 structures are located in active erosion zones in the coast. Just to make things more complicated, I think we don't have, we need you all in Puerto Rico after you finish, because we need to have a little bit better planning processes. In terms of, we have 11 airports. Almost all of our airports are in the coast, within 1 kilometer of the coast. Puerto Rico power generation plants, 5 public and 2 private, are located within 1 kilometer. Most of the water infrastructure is located along the coast, and you see those are hundreds of kilometers of pipelines, and 28 waste treatment plants, and 81 industrial parks are located in the coast. That means that we have a very high vulnerability, and we are very limited in terms of preparedness. Just to give you statistics from 1956 to 2011, from 26 major disasters that were declared by the federal government, and 6 emergencies declaration. We had all but 2 that were caused by natural hazards, floods, landslides, hurricanes, droughts, and heavy rain. If you don't know Puerto Rico, well, you're more than welcome to come down here during the spring break. You can stay also at the University of Puerto Rico and stay for at least 1 semester. Then you go back and graduate from University of North Carolina. For sure, we can do some kind of exchange. But this, you see, here at San Juan, this is our capital. This is where our colonization began. But you see this little piece here, right here, is what you see right here. A huge amount of infrastructure exposed from every side for coastal hazards and all kinds of hazards. This is San Juan. This is Mayagüez. We are located more or less, I am talking right now, right from here. Okay? And this is right in my campus. You see, this is the parking lot, student parking lots get flooded like 5 foot of water. And this is Ponce. This is to the south. This is the northeast. This is in the west coast. This is in the south. This is Ponce. This is a big industrial park. Well, it's interesting, but most of these areas, except this one, was very hardly hit by the hurricane, except the southwest coast. But look what happened in December 2019 and early January 2019. We had a little tremble there, an earthquake, and then that was December 28th. But a few days after that, we have a 6.4 earthquake. After that, we have had about 10,000 earthquakes that we can feel. And that's, we were trembling all the time. And well, about $3.1 billion was lost. And unfortunately, 3 lives were lost. But we have had replicas of that one, and we have many replicas, which cause many damages in the surrounding areas. Each point that you see here, it's an epicenter of a strong or a low intensity or magnitude earthquake, but it's all around the island. If we feel like the earthquakes disappear, well, we can be having aftershocks for almost 10 years. Right now, if you look at here, I'm going to concentrate here, a magnitude 5 earthquake. You see, this is the area. A magnitude 5 earthquake has a probability over 99% to happen in the next in the next years, and 50% chance in the next 10 years, between 3 and 10 years. But we have 50% chance that we have a magnitude 6. Those two are very, very strong, and it will cause a lot of damages. We are still very exposed to these earthquakes. I'm not going to talk anymore about earthquakes, just to give you in advance that we can come back sometime just to make sure that we enter into this area. Well, our past suggests our future. This is where Puerto Rico is located. This is the Hurricane Isle, and that we are exposed to hundreds of hurricanes in history. In terms of floods, most of our coastal valleys are floodplains. What you see in the map at the top right side is historical riverine floods. Those happen. The one and below that is the flood-prone areas done by the FEMA flood elevation maps. As you see, we haven't experienced all the flood levels that we can be exposed. But these are typical scenarios after our urban floods and riverine floods. We are exposed to landslides. Do you see at the top of my screen, do you see a line there? Right here? Let me move this somewhere else.
We do see your cursor, or at least I do.
Okay, perfect. Okay, well, these are experienced landslides are function of rainfall, topography, and geology and soils. When you combine all three, a heavy rainfall, steep topography, and loose soils, then you have the potential for landslide. Puerto Rico is very steep. The relief, it's very, very variable. But you see to the left, just to talk about rainfall, this is an event which accumulated 24 inches of rainfall in 24 hours. Then we have another 131, 30, almost 32 inches of rainfall. This was in the center of the island. This is in the south, accumulated at 32 inches of rainfall in a little bit in about 30 hours. What was the consequence of this storm, particularly this one? Well, at this particular place, you see these landslides. This was very unfortunate because about 130 people lost their lives and they got buried underneath the landslide. I had the opportunity of going there. It was very, very scary situation. Let's talk about Maria. Maria happened in September 19, 2017, something that we have experienced before, not as intense as Maria. Maximum wind, sustained winds 173 miles per hour, although there were wind gusts about 200 miles per hour. The trajectory is defined right here through the center of the island, moving very slowly at 10 miles per hour. This is almost a Category 5 hurricane, which is very, very strong, accumulated almost 38 inches of rainfall in less than 2 days. I'm not going to enter. This is something for your reference. Whenever you can get into these links, you can go and you can look into what is in there. This is the Doppler radar before and after the hurricane. The Doppler radar was something that we needed just to make sure that we could get the information to make sure that we make better decisions in the future. This is the old one. It was right on the hurricane track. It got damaged. We estimated that winds here, wind gusts should be between 175 and 200 miles per hour at that position. And this is the new one that they rebuilt. I hope that could withstand another Maria. From the Department of Homeland Security perspective, well, the critical infrastructure for the community to live, develop, have social well-being, economic development, environmental quality, it's identifying 16 different subjects here. Well, of all those, I could identify that 14 out of 16 were touched or impacted in Puerto Rico. Well, some of the impacts on the infrastructure could be the coastal flooding and erosion, the urban flooding, landslide, river flooding, bridge failures, destruction of roadside appurtenances, collapses of communications, radio, television, internet, telephone. Maybe the one that people missed more was the telephone, collapse of power grid, major damage to seaport, airports, and air traffic control facilities, and most of the supply chain was stopped because we couldn't receive anything, any goods from air or from the sea. They were already, their operation were stopped. Well, this is a very interesting diagram that I found to find out about interdependencies of Puerto Rico's critical infrastructure. If you see, if you lack power and Puerto Rico lack power, about lack of power put 95% of the cellular site out of service, and then you don't have communication. If you don't have communication, maybe then the first responders couldn't articulate their strategies. Actually, many places were not accessible because roads were washed out or bridges, or there was no enough energy or fuel to transport most of our transportation means, and also without power, pumps, drinking water weren't unavailable. That means that wastewater were just flushing into the creeks and were contaminating most of the sources of pure water. With all this interconnection, what happens? Most of the normal operation of the community get disturbed, and it turns that it affects health and services, which really put us in a very, very critical situation for weeks and months. This is a diagram that I developed. Some of the more or less shows the same, many multi-hazards that we experienced during the hurricane, and examples with pictures to the left. But the important thing here is just to look into the economic impact. The economic impact was estimated near $94 billion, 40 billion loss in economic output, and 55 billion in property and infrastructure damages. One of the very critical situations was that directly or indirectly, about 3,000 people lost their lives in a period of time because directly or indirectly impacted by the hurricane, particularly for the lack of services. The power failure was a complete blackout, and about 70% of the customers were without powers for over a month, and 15% still in February, about 6 months after the hurricane, didn't have power. We had a very strong shortage of essential goods and services because the supply chain was totally interrupted for weeks and months. We didn't have fuel, we didn't have ice, we didn't have water, we didn't have food. Then everything got complicated because the environmental safety get compromised with hazardous waste, vectors, mosquitoes, pathogens, which you don't have the services to take care of them right away. In the long run and in the long term, I think our objectives is just to make sure that we learn from the experience and we develop capacity building on economic development, environmental quality, social well-being, sustainability, resilience, and social justice. Well, one of the very critical things is the social justice that happens during injustice that happen during events like this. This is just an example. This is the water distribution system for the Mayagüez area. This is my hometown here at the university. All those areas where I put a circle, well, you can see the picture to the right. Most of the treatment plants were flooded, no power. Then we didn't have access to potable water sources, nor treatment the sanitary sewer. This is how Puerto Rico looks in a normal night during summertime, and then during the blackouts, you can see Puerto Rico disappear during the night. This is typical of the failure of the power grid. It's much more than power interruption. It's a total destruction of the generation plants, the transmission lines, the distribution lines, all the infrastructure, the mini plants, and this is a combination of lack of structural integrity of the poles, but also the combination of many other factors like other structures that felt on the transmission lines. This is typically also the failure of telecommunications. You see, these towers are not supposed to fail. They're supposed to be designed for 175 miles per hour. Well, maybe the wind gusts were over that. but that's something that I'm pretty sure should be in some courts in Puerto Rico being discussed right now. But you see the level of destruction that happened at that time, and this is typical what happened at the time. Wherever there was a communication a tower, well, people stay around, creating a very critical situation in the highway. Well, in terms of rainfall, this is the rainfall distribution. If you see, this is the point where 38 inches of rainfall were recorded, but in the whole island, the least we received was 5.8. 3 inches of rainfall in 3 to 6 hours in Puerto Rico causes floods. Can you imagine 6, 8 with rain bursts within the storm in a very short period of time? This was one of the most critical storms in terms of rainfall in the history of the island. Well, this is what happened. These are the urban flooding, typical in every area, every community. Most of our communities are in the coast, as I mentioned before. Riverine floods, 18 stream gauges recorded the extreme historical top 4 ranked floods. And there is a list of all those. And not only those were within the first 4 in terms of rank, but they also were the most critical in terms of flooding in very long time. This is typical what happens in the bridges that are not built to sustain floods like this. These are typical communities which they are not supposed to be flooded. This is in the north of Puerto Rico. This is the impacts in one of our, this was very critical because downstream of this dam, this is what's called Oaxaca Dam. And what happened is that the Oaxaca overtopped through the emergency spillway, which is right here. Then it broke a pipe which crosses through here. You see, there is a irrigation channel. There was a pipe right there. It broke, and all this became eroded and scoured. And as you see, the scouring was moving towards the dam, earth dam. If this fails, that could be a very, very critical situation. Well, this, fortunately, it didn't happen, and this has been very well reinforced. In terms of bridges, all these yellow points are the bridge distribution, which are inspected, were inspected after the hurricane. About 2,000 bridges in Puerto Rico require various visits. About 200 of them presented damages. 27% were severely damaged, and 63% moderately damaged. Over 60 bridges were severely damaged. Well, if you don't know what is a damage to a bridge, one of the main problems is the clogging with debris that is collected throughout the basin and comes, and this is a culvert. You see, this is a box culvert without a capacity to move this debris through the waterwork there. You see, this is here in my hometown. They get clogged and they get converted into dams. This is what happens when they get clogged. Water flows through the approach slabs, and roads get eroded, and then the bridge collapses. This one is very interesting. This is in my hometown where I grew up in Ciales. You see, it used to be a beautiful bridge, 4 spans. You see this circle here? This is when I was a child. I used to go to watch all the flooding in that area. Well, what happened? This is what stayed behind after the flood. The bridge was substituted with a a temporary one. This is the construction process. They built a new one. This is the new one, but it's temporary. And this is the new bridge. Very different than the new one. We're expecting that to be replaced. We are not sure if that will happen in the future. Well, these are in many other places. Well, they were using, like they call Bailey Bridge trusses, steel trusses, which is very quick to assemble. They protected the support and the corner of the bridge. One of the things very critical is we had over 70,000 landslides throughout the island. That's huge. Landslide look like this, you see? This is a $1 million house. You see how it stayed behind? This is over 100 million, $1 million house. You see what happens here? This is at the coast. A whole house went down the hill. And there is another area here. But we had 70,000 of this in the island. Most of them shallow like this one, but you see enough to make a house. This is a reinforced concrete and wooden house that collapsed due to the landslide. If we move to the coast, and that was in the upland, well, this is what happens in our coast. Coastal flooding and erosion. This structure collapsed. This building collapsed. This building was eroded, and actually they evacuated. This one got broke. Actually, it separated right here because the foundation was flushed out to the, most of the foundation was removed by the sand. This is here nearby. This is a picture that I took. Actually, Gavin Smith had the chance to go right here. This is a combination, a compound flooding between a riverine flood that came out here and the coastal flooding that came back. There were houses all around here. They were all flushed out. You see all the infrastructure here. This is drainage. We have pipelines. We have power. If we consider on top of that the seawater rise because of the climate change, there is a projection between 3, 6, or 9 feet in the future. But let's say we are conservative and we say, okay, between 3 and 5 feet more of water in the coast. This is what happened now. Can you imagine what will happen if we have 3 to 6 more feet of water in the coast? But you see, this is not natural. This is human intervention. That means we need to make sure that we don't do this in the future. Well, there are good practices. This is an informal house, but they made sure that they built a frame to put their wooden house on top, very well anchored beams and columns, and they use metal anchorage just to anchor all the wooden elements. They put also metal cables to make sure that the roof didn't move out. They anchored it to the concrete elements. And this, actually, the coast, the water came all the way, the seawater came all the way, went underneath the house, and you see, they elevated about the base floor elevation. And this is an example of resilient construction and there is no formal construction, no design, no inspection, other by that guy that is in the balcony there. This is typically, on the other hand, not by water, by winds. This is a total collapse of a structural steel basketball court in Cayey to the east of the island. This is the same thing to the other side of the island. This is another basketball court that failed, not the structure, but the anchorage to the structure, the roof and the structure was very poor. These are wooden houses, informal construction, very poorly built. And you see a lot of money invested there, but at least they kept our flag there. There is something that we can learn from here. You see, this is a wooden house, this is a wooden house, this is wooden house, and this is a concrete house. Very resilient. It's built very informally, but the concrete is much more resistant and resilient against extreme winds. In terms of roadside appurtenances, most of them failed. This is typical situation in terms of essential services. Long lines. We had to wait for 6-8 hours to get 1 gallon of gasoline. No money and these machines. These were typical everywhere. Thank God we didn't have the pandemic at that time. This was what happened at the airport. This is the main airport in Puerto Rico. Well, something that we have developed is just to pick up from the literature, and we developed this creative cycle for resilient design, because the way we have to think very structurized. We have unexpected events. Then we need to address the risk hazard, evaluate the exposure of our infrastructure, evaluate and assess the vulnerability, do a damage assessment, potential damage assessment. Vulnerability assessment. Then we become prepared, knowing our risk and exposure. Then the event occurs. Then we have to respond. We have to have a plan to respond and be safe. Protect your life first. Then you make a damage assessment. Go through the recovery process. Improve your resilience. Doing mitigation, reconstruction. You have to learn from your experience. Then the education capacity building process comes. Then you develop a new state for expected events where your improved resiliency is in place. Now you move back to wait for the next event. And that's what we are expected to do. Well, let's see what we did. Well, a major disaster declaration was declared by the federal government for make sure that eligible costs to repair, replace, and mitigate future damages to private property, including homes and access routes damage. Actually, it's much more broader than this. And then the Department of Homeland Security, based on that, created what it's called, well, we call it the Center of Excellence in Puerto Rico to take care of this. The HSOAC, the Homeland Security Operational Analysis. About 2,000 people work together in only one building. And well, there is a link that you can go into that. If you can go to this site, you can get everything that's been happening in Puerto Rico, and you will have a better lecture than what I am doing. Well, this is to support Puerto Rico disaster recovery planning. Puerto Rico vision after the hurricane was just to identify different sectors: society, economy, resilience, and infrastructure. We are focusing on infrastructure, but the same thing had to be done with society, education, health, sustainability. In terms of economy, to develop a stronger economy from these opportunities. And in terms of resilience, make sure that people, business, community at different scales become more resilient, more redundant in terms of safety. Well, the recovery sectors, well defined. Actually, FEMA hired Rand Corporation, a very well-known company in the States. Actually, we worked with them for 2 years. And these are the sectors that they identify at the beginning: economic recovery and resilience, human recovery, natural and cultural resources. This wasn't in the previous one. Physical infrastructure and connecting communities. That's communication. And well, If we take only infrastructure, you go to this site, you will see what's happening with housing, public buildings, telecommunications, transportation, water, energy. But they have more than 200 action items or action activities that they are focusing on. And each one of this one, there is a strategy, there is a plan, and there is an investment to make sure that, for example, housing will be financed with about $20 billion of housing and public buildings. Telecommunications, there should be about 20 billions to develop that. Transportation, the Department Federal Highway Administration is supporting, they already allocated about $2 billion to that. Water, there will be the power plants, transmission lines, distribution lines, a pumping station will be rebuilt. Energy, it's maybe the first priority. Over $20 billion will be allocated to that. Well, the recovery cost was estimated in $139 billion. Out of those $94 billion, the federal government is committed to, and private insurance to about 94 billions. The rest should come from Puerto Rico government, private sector, and public and private partnerships. The office from Puerto Rico, I'm sorry, I'm getting a little bit, I'm taking a little bit longer, but I am almost finishing. We created what is called Call 3 for the Recovery, Reconstruction, and Resiliency. This is what communicate with FEMA and Department of Homeland Security. FEMA was doing all the logistics. Then they transferred this to the Call 3 and they work together. FEMA financed the recovery and Puerto Rico administered the funding. And this is a transparent system that Puerto Rico put in place. And the recovery programs comes from mainly 4 sources from the federal government: the individual assistance, which goes to individuals and to households; public assistance that go to municipalities and certain private and nonprofit organizations; the hazard mitigation grant programs. And this is where we work, because here, this is just for the immediate recovery and just to let people go back to operate again. But this one, this hazard mitigation grant program is a state administered post-disaster program that focuses on the reduction and the protection of life and property in the long run. And that requires that whatever is done has to be resilient and should be based on the best state of practice. Other recovery funds come from different agencies. Well, this is what has happened until now. $68 billion have been allocated out of the $94 billion that are expected. 43 billions have been obligated. Out of those, they have disbursed $18 billion, which is a lot of money. And it's divided, like most of that money comes from the disaster declaration based on the hurricanes, Irma and Maria. You see, the others are less than $1 billion, and this is about 42 billions. But let me tell you, I found that in no natural disaster in the United States, the federal government had been able to spend more than $2 billion per year. And that means that we had to do a lot of effort, to put a lot of effort to make sure that this is done, not in 40 years, but in the next 10 to 20 years. Well, these are some of the activities that we have been involved. I'm sorry, I just copied some slides that we presented in the ASCE 2020 Virtual Convention Conference that we presented this. And these are my partners, like Luis Aponte is a faculty in the Department of Civil Engineering. Carla Lopez is a copy in my project. Myself and another a person that worked with us. These are the mitigation assessment team that comes and do the evaluation and write a report from where recommendation comes. Then the resilience partnership. All those are working together. You see, we are there. We are here. This is the core 3. This is the ACE, University of Puerto Rico-Mayagüez, National Science Foundation, universities, and many others that are actually, there are dozens that are missing, we are missing there. Major projects, one is a FEMA P2020 that's go to the mitigation assessment team report, the Puerto Rico special wind region maps to identify micro regions in terms of wind distribution, the prescriptive this home design project, the National Construction Safety Team. They are all working together and they're putting together reports from recommendation comes, and the reconstruction should be based on those findings. NIST had the critical facilities assessment. They have launched a project to conduct building assessment, not only for the wind, but also for the earthquakes, because one came after the other. These are the typical buildings. What you see here are the effects of the earthquakes nearby my hometown. The MAT report recommendation for Puerto Rico included adopting the 2018 International Building Codes and strengthen the multi-hazard provision for codes in Puerto Rico, and to develop descriptive design for affordable code compliance residential construction. I think I have, let me see. Well, this kind of housing are the typical that they are recommended that could be developed in modules. Adoption of the latest model codes, those have been proven that have proven that worked. Well, they are recommending, and well, from there we developed what is called the Puerto Rico codes in 2018, adopted to Puerto Rico, and our faculty participated in developing this code. Well, this is work also in a collaborative work. You see, this is a typical house. I'm not going to enter into details, but this initiative go all the way to these recommendations. One of the very interesting things is developing the topographic microzoning for wind engineering, which is one of the most beautiful works that I have seen. One of our faculty is working there. Well, all this I mentioned that capacity building is very important. This is our project. This is a typical activity, Reimagine Puerto Rico, an initiative that we got involved with other partners. And we have impacted, like at this moment, we have impacted about 1,600 people, and we have put about 8,500 contact hour person and distributed in fresh body who provided formal or informal certificates, and we try to incorporate a line of formal education and one which is professional education. This is our project for the Coastal Resilience Center. This is an example what we did with the capstone course with our students. We put the project in the coast, an area which you see, those are the hazard maps for flooding. You see, there are 3 maps there. We asked them, this is the community, asked them to buy out and relocate. Actually, Gavin Smith gave us a conference in this course. 31 students, 5 faculty, 2 graduate students. This is what they produced. This is the concept, okay? They filled, elevated, and these buildings are against even tsunamis. And they retreat from the coast and develop a park and develop a community, not just a housing complex. In conclusion, I can say that after the worst natural disaster under the worst possible social, economic, and infrastructure conditions Puerto Rico has faced in history, the catastrophe turns into a great opportunity to innovate and reconstruct it reconstructed under the most rigorous, resilient, sustainable, educated, and just standards to ensure its people the brightest future. Actually, the picture, just to see the Department of Homeland Security and the project, all the people who have worked together with me, and all those partners that have been working and supporting us. These are several of our partners. Thank you. This is another sunset a little bit to the north. And well, I can take all the questions that you have, and I will answer only those that I know.
Well, thank you so much for a fascinating presentation. Beautiful pictures. Those always help a lot. You didn't have a picture of your avocado tree that's in your yard.
Yes, actually, this year has a lot of fruits. Many fruits. Yes.
Oh, that's wonderful. That is very heartening for the future that something survived and thrived. So in the interest of time, I am going to pick out a couple of the themes that I had repeated questions submitted to me about. And I thought for lack of any other way to approach this, that they might hit several students at once. So the first issue is regarding statehood versus being a territory. And that came up several times amongst the students. And so just randomly, Hardy, do you want to talk about your question about that? Hardy, are you still with us? Thought you were. Oh, I see you. I see your name.
He has his microphone is muted.
Yeah, I asked him to unmute. Let's see. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and read it out. And it's kind of typical of the other statehood versus territorial issues. So does Puerto Rico's potential statehood make any difference in the future of this program? Speaking of the whatever it was that was on sheet number 3, I can't remember which program. Or is that mainly incidental matter? So it really doesn't even matter specifically which program. It's just is how big of an issue is this debate about being a state versus a territory, and how does that impact what Puerto Rico is capable of doing, the politics behind it? I mean, this could be a very large question.
This is very interesting question that requires another conference, but we have been working with that issue for over 100 years. Since 1898 until today, we've been working with this with the United States, because Puerto Rico passed as after the war, a reward from the Hispano-American War, and we've been working with this for over a century. In 1952, we had our own constitution under what is called the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, which defined Puerto Rico as a territory under the United States of America. It's called a state, a Commonwealth. It's a little bit of a state, a little bit of independent, and a little bit of both. And at the end, none of all of them, because we are subordinated to the federal government, and we don't have representation with voice and votes in the Congress. That makes a big difference, because we have what is called the resident commissioner, which is equivalent to a congresswoman at this time, but she can only speak, she cannot vote. That means that, a vote, it's power, it's equity, it's equality, it's justice. Well, Puerto Rico has to decide between statehood and independence or Commonwealth. We had elections. There was a referendum. 52% voted in favor of statehood. But the political party that represented statehood only had 32%. And I think the other party, the Commonwealth, had 31. That means that it's a big issue. It's like the national sport in Puerto Rico. Everybody speak politics every day. Everybody have the right answer. I don't have it. I think I have my political preferences, and there are some limitations, very strong limitations in terms of participating in equality with the states. That's what I can say. That means if we become a state, we have the we can be equal to all states, and we can compete, not as we are right now. The president, well, the Congress and the president with a signature can dump us as independent, or they can admit us to be a state, because they always say, okay, we will honor whatever you decide, but we've been doing this for over 50 years and nothing has happened. With that introduction, I leave it to the voters and politicians to let you know more details, but there are certain disadvantages not to be a state during situations like this. Although we participate as we have benefits from federal programs. Actually, it depends also on the president came to Puerto Rico and threw paper towers to people. I think there is a different approach right now. That means that this is based on people too, not only on policies. The attitude, the people. The previous one, I'm not sure he knew what he was doing.
I think probably a lot of people would agree with you on that. So I remember well the paper towel incident. That was pretty shocking.
Pretty shocking.
So thank you for that. That was really interesting. I've got about 1 minute. So let me hit really quickly on benefit cost analysis. We had pretty many questions that kind of dealt with that issue and how that folds into mitigation decisions and that kind of thing. Really, can you?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, you can finish.
No, I'm done.
Okay. When you do feasibility analysis and you compare cost versus benefits, make sure, because you are planners, that you are not thinking about money. You are thinking about benefits and cost. Benefits are, it could be money, tangibles, and intangibles. How do you value a life? How do you value environment? How do you value ecology? How do you value values? How do you value equity, social equity? That means that when you do feasibility analysis, it's well beyond benefit cost ratio, dollars on above dollars divided by dollars. But when you put, and I learned this by the Federal Register from 1968, you have a big picture in terms of when you do feasibility analysis. Social justice have to be there, and you have to support the people. It doesn't matter how much it costs. You have to protect life. It doesn't matter how much it costs. Of course, there is a limitation where you don't have enough resources to support, like in the pandemic. But there is you have to go through the federal procedures, methodologies, and regulations to make sure that you comply with the standards that are in place. There are about 10,000 projects in Puerto Rico that have been submitted. About 5,000 have gone at least one step into the process. But that's what we will be doing at the end. And how do you do feasibility analysis for that? Very difficult. They are just trying to justify the cost. We worked for 2 years estimating cost with Rand Corporation from the university, for transportation projects, from water projects, for housing, for many of those. And it's very difficult because the uncertainties are very big, and the complexity of the projects are very, very complicated. We develop a methodology to address the complexity of the projects. But in these cases, what you have to justify if the needs for investing the amount of money that we're talking. And that's what I saw through the process, and it's very uncertain. And actually, what they're going to do once FEMA approves the funding, it's a fixed price. It's given to the municipalities. The municipalities, if they overrun or underrun, they keep the money or they keep the debt. Very interesting.